Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at 2 Samuel chapters 15 through 19. This will be the Absalom rebellion in our continuing study of the historical books. So far, most recently, we saw in chapters 11 through 12 David's adultery and the murder of Uriah that David tried to keep under wraps, but it came to light, and he was confronted with it by the prophet Nathan, and he confessed. Then we had chapter 13, where those same sorts of issues begin to bring home to David's family, and his oldest son, Amnon, rapes his half sister Tamar. Next, in the rest of chapter 13, Absalom, who is furious with both Amnon, and I think it spills over to David too, for not having really done anything about it, not having brought any punishment. He plots and he waits, and about 2 years later, he murders Amnon, and then for that reason goes into exile. And then in chapter 14 is Absalom eventually, after 3 years, returning from exile, but there's still underlying hostility that still remains. At the end of chapter 14, we see that in all Israel, there was no one as handsome as Absalom. It's almost like he's running for public office. Notice, so highly praised from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there was no defect in him when he cut the hair of his head, and it was at the end of every year that he cut it, for it was heavy on him, so that he cut it. He weighed the hair of his head at 200 shekels. That's a few pounds by the king's weight. And so here's a guy who looks good. We're going to find out he's got a winning personality. He's got everything but the Lord. It reminds me of today's politicians. Sometimes it reminds me of some of the popular television pastors that you see on television. And I don't want to label all of them like that. But people like somebody that looks good and that sounds good, and a people person, no matter whether or not their character is infused with the character of Jesus. Chapter 15, verse 1. Now it came about after this that Absalom provided for himself a chariot and horses and 50 men as runners before him. He's campaigning. He's doing what kings do. He's trying to look like a king. Verse 2, Absalom used to rise early and stand beside the way to the gate. Remember, the gate is that portion of the city, it's not just the entryway. There would be a gate structure that would be almost like a mini city itself, with a way in from the outside, and then a way out to lead into the rest of the city. And this is where the king would sit. And so he goes to the place where you might be used to finding kings, and he'd stand beside the way to the gate. And when any man had a suit to come to the king for judgment, Absalom would call to him and say, "From what city are you?" And he would say, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." He would, ask interesting questions. He'd get to know them, real people person. Verse 3, then Absalom would say to him, "See, your claims are good and right, but no man listens to you on the part of the king." The king's not really doing his job. Moreover, Absalom would say, "Oh, that one would appoint me judge in the land. Then every man who has any suit or cause could come to me, and I would give him justice. I would be a better king than you know who." And that's his subtext. Verse 5, and when a man came near to prostrate himself before him, to treat him as though he's a king, he would put out his hand and take hold of him and kiss him. "No, you don't have to bow before me. We're just going to be buddies. We're going to be a newer and friendlier kind of king." Verse 6, in this manner Absalom dealt with all Israel who came to the king for judgment. So Absalom stole away the hearts of the men of Israel. It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen, and relatively quickly. We get to verse 7 now. It came about at the end of 40 years. Now you say, well, that's not relatively quickly. I suspect that we have a typo in the text. 40 years, that's a long time to consider when David only reigned for 40 years. What's going on here? Well, both the NIV, the New International Version, the ESV, the English Standard Version, and the New English Translation, as well as a number of others, like the Revised Standard Version, render this at the end of 4 years. They think that there was a typo here. It's not that they have a different reading in some of the Greek manuscripts or in some of the Septuagint manuscripts. The Septuagint and the Hebrew text all say 40 years. In spite of that, they say that just doesn't sound right. It sounds like somebody inadvertently And the only way to do this is you put an "eem" on the end of the word for 4, and now it becomes 40. Um, and that's possible. I think that's, in fact, I would say that's probably likely. Now, maybe there's another explanation. At the same time, you say, well, what about the New American Standard? And the King James also has 40 years. What about those? And I have to say, I admire them for this reason. They said, we're not going to change the text just because we don't think it fits. We're going to leave what the Hebrew, and in this case, as well as the Greek Septuagint, we're going to leave what they say because we don't want to just go and change the Word of God. And I think that the copyists for the Hebrew text, the various texts that we have, both the Leningrad Codex and as well as when we go and look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think the copyists, the Hebrew scribes who copy those things probably had the same idea, where they said, we're pretty sure that this is a typo from somewhere way back when, but we're not going to change it unless we, found another older copy that had a different reading. We're not going to change the Word of God on our own. And my reaction is good for them. I love the way that they try to be loyal to the text. Well, in any case, notice Absalom said to the king, "Please let me go and pay my vow, which I have vowed to the Lord back in the day in Hebron, back when I was not banished, but when I was in sort of an exile." Verse 8, "For your servant vowed a vow while I was living at Geshur in Aram, saying, If the Lord shall indeed bring me back to Jerusalem, then I will serve the Lord." And so notice he's saying, let me go here to serve the Lord. Really, he's going there not to serve the Lord, but to try to overthrow his own father, to overthrow the government. This is hypocrisy. This is like one who comes to Jesus and kisses him on the cheek as a sign of betrayal. And so Absalom sent spies throughout all the tribes of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then you shall say, Absalom is king in Jerusalem." Why Hebron? Well, first of all, he's got a better chance of pulling it off when father's not around. And also, he's going to Hebron, where David was first proclaimed king. Before he was king over all of Israel, he was king here at Hebron. And so Absalom sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilo, while he was offering the sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong. So Ahithophel he's involved in the conspiracy. Now, Ahithophel, why would he go over to Absalom's side? We have maybe a hint where we read when we get to 2 Samuel 23, verse 34, and we're not there yet, but we're going to find out that Eliam was the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite. And you say, okay, well, how does that help me? Back in 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 3, when we were first introduced to Bathsheba, David had asked the question, is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? So if Bathsheba was the daughter of Eliam, and Eliam was the son of Ahithophel, and if it's the same Eliam, they're both from the same city, if that all connects, then Ahithophel would be the grandfather of Bathsheba, and maybe he was rather fond of his son-in-law. Maybe he himself had not forgiven David for what David had done back in their family history. Maybe. Now, it's also possible that this is a different Eliam. So I don't want to be dogmatic here, but maybe there's more of the family history that's getting in on this. And notice while he's offering the sacrifices, and the conspiracy was strong, for the people increased continually with Absalom. Absalom is growing and growing and growing in the polls and in popularity. Now, a messenger came to David saying, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." The word's getting out. And David said to all his servants who were with him at Jerusalem, "Arise, let us flee, for otherwise none of us will escape from Absalom. Go in haste, or he will overtake us quickly and bring down calamity on us and strike the city with the edge of the sword." So David hears the news. He's maybe been a little out of touch, or maybe he was in touch, I don't know. But the word gets out, and it comes to David, and he makes a command decision. We can't stay and fight. Absalom is already too popular. I think he was already popular in David's heart, even though they had this rift between them. Um, And David says, we have to abandon ship, we have to abandon the city and leave. And so the king's servants said to the king, behold, your servants are ready to do whatever my lord the king chooses. They are with him. So the king went out, and all his household with him. But the king left 10 concubines. What's a concubine? That's like a wife that came without her dowry. I don't want to be mean, but I'm going to call it like a second-class wife. The wife of a not so wealthy person. But he had these 10 concubines. Notice he leaves them behind to keep the house, to keep things running, but he's going to leave. Now, I want you to notice how parallel this is with 1 Samuel, where in 1 Samuel we had the birth of Samuel. Now we've got in 2 Samuel the death of Saul, so a birth and a death. Each one is followed by a song, by Hannah's song and David's song. Next, notice chapter 3 in 1 Samuel. Samuel hears God. David's been listening to the Lord. We had war with the Philistines, war with the Philistines. We each had in each book the travels of the Ark of the Covenant. In 1 Samuel, it was because the Ark had been captured. Now it's because David had brought the Ark to Jerusalem, not in a time of war, but in a time of peace. We had read about Saul being established. We've read about David being established. We saw Saul's ultimate sin. He had others before, but in the situation with Agag. And now we've seen Agag not putting him to death, with David and Bathsheba and putting to death Uriah the Hittite. So that was David's sin. We saw both confronted by the prophet of God, and now in both stories, in both 1 Samuel and again in 2 Samuel, David goes back to being a fugitive. We've been here before, but this time he's got a contingent with him, and they're leaving Jerusalem. Jerusalem hadn't been it had been a Canaanite city earlier, so David hadn't been there in 1 Samuel. As David is leaving, we read that Ittai the Gittite, he decides to come with David. And you say, well, what is a Gittite? That's somebody from Gath. Remember, that's a Philistine city. And so here's somebody who had been a Philistine who had come over to the side of Israel and over to the side of David. The king said to Ittai the Gittite, why will you also go with us? Return and remain with the king, for you are a foreigner, that's what a Philistine would be, and also an exile from the Philistines. He's left the Philistines to join David. Return to your own place. Go back home to Philistia. You came only yesterday. I don't know if it was literally the day before, but relatively recently. And shall I today make you a wanderer with us while I go where I will? Return and take back your brothers. Mercy and truth be with you. May you go with my blessings. And Ittai answered the king. He answered the king and said, "As the Lord lives," that's oath language, "and as my lord the king lives," sort of a double oath. "Surely wherever my lord the king may be, whether for death or for life, there also your servant will be. Where you go, I go. If you live, I'm going to follow you." And so notice whether death or life, this is going to be a life and death thing for Ittai. He's going to follow the Lord no matter what. He's going to follow David no matter what. Therefore, David said to Ittai, go and pass over. Now, I want you to catch that pass over part. And he says it again, so Ittai the Gittite passed over. The term here is ever, avar is the Hebrew word. It's where we get our word Hebrew. And a Hebrew is one who passes over. So he has come, in a sense, to become one of the quote-unquote Hebrews, one who passed over, just like Abraham had passed over the rivers of Mesopotamia to come to the place where God would have him to be. And all of his men and all of the little ones who were with him. And so he and his contingent, the entire family, all his followers, pass over to follow after David. While all the country was weeping with a loud voice, all the people passed over, so it's not just them. The king also passed over the brook Kidron. Kidron is there's a valley just east of Jerusalem. If you're standing on the Temple Mount, the temple wasn't there yet, so Jerusalem as it existed in his day was a little bit south of that, but the valley stretches around that old city. They passed over the brook Kidron, and all the people pass over toward the way of the wilderness. And so they're all passing over, they're going in that direction. And you find this contingent, those that are for David, but also those that are against David. And so we already noted Ahithophel had been in on the plot. He is the counselor to Absalom, a very wise man, very well connected apparently, and very much against David. He's actually going to be the chief counselor against David on behalf of Absalom. But now you have Joab. Now Joab was David's nephew, and so he's going to be true to David. As long as David's alive, Joab's going to be true to him, sometimes in his own way, sometimes not the way David wants, but still, he's trying to do right by. And let me just say, I think Joab's actually trying to do right by Joab, but he's loyal to David. We already saw Ittai. He's a newcomer, a Philistine, a Gentile, turned Hebrew. We have Zadok and Abiathar. These are priests, and they bring along with them the Ark of the Covenant. And David says, no, 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 I'm not playing games with the Ark of the Covenant. I'm not, in the past, there have been kings who tried, or not kings, but there have been people in Israel that tried to take it along into a battle, thinking I'll sort of maneuver God into fighting for me. I'm not playing games with the Ark. Send the Ark back. Maybe I'll be able to come back to Jerusalem, but I'm not taking the Ark out into the wild. And so he sends it back with two of the priestly sons. They're also priests themselves, Ahimaaz and Jonathan. And they are going to be sort of spies, sort of undercover spies, where they're going to take the ark back and just take a listen to find out what Absalom is doing and then come and report. Now, when that happens, they're actually going to have to sneak out, and Absalom's going to have people looking for them before it's over, where they're going to come down to a town and they're looking to hide from Absalom's forces. And so they're going to, for a time, hide down in a well just to make sure they don't get caught, maybe get their feet a little bit wet. And then they'll get back. They'll finally make it to David. So, spoiler alert: they're going to give their report, and everything will be good on their behalf. Now we have somebody named Ziba as well, and notice I put a question mark here. Is he for David or is he against David? Actually, he shows up. I put him on the side against David, but maybe I'm doing him a little bit of an injustice. He shows up and he says, and Ziba had been the chief steward of Saul, and Ziba had David had actually said to Ziba, is there anyone who's left from Saul's line? And Ziba had said, well, yes, there's this one. Mephibosheth, he's a son of Jonathan. He's lame in both feet. And David had said, fine, I want to show preference to Jonathan. You have been the steward of Saul. Now you're going to be the steward of Jonathan and all the property. Remember, if there were no children, then Ziba, as the chief steward, he would inherit. So he's got a vested interest in seeing the son of Jonathan not take charge. So he shows up with David and he says, Mephibosheth would have been with you, but he didn't want to be with you. Instead, he said, how great it is that you're getting out, because this will give him a chance maybe to become king. Now, you say, well, that sounds like he's for David, except that when we see Mephibosheth, remember he's lame in both feet, he's going to say, I would have come with you, but Ziba, he sort of gave me a flat tire. He took my, I ordered my donkey to be saddled, and I was ready to come, and instead, he took off with my donkey. he left me stranded. And so, whose side is Ziba on? And my answer is, we're not really sure. So I'm going to put him, maybe unjustly here, as one who is against David, but at this point, he's pretending to be for David. And then I have Hushai, another one. I don't have to have a question mark here because Hushai is another counselor. And David says to Hushai, no, go back and pretend that you're just like Ahithophel. Pretend that you're against me. And so he's not just undercover. He's actually going to be a double agent. He's going to go back and pretend that he's working for Absalom, when really he's working for David. And we're going to see how that pans out. And then I have Shimei. Shimei, he's easy because he's a relative of Saul, and he's very much against David. In fact, he shows up to follow David a bit, but not to follow him, just to hurl insults and curses upon his name and throw dirt and other things at him. And Shimei is just being as nasty as he can be. He's just so glad that David is getting his. And so, no doubt about, no question mark was Shimei. Now they leave Jerusalem, and when I took this picture, I'm standing on the mount of the Temple Mount. I'm looking. You can see the Kidron Valley in the foreground, that where the land goes down, and then it goes up to the Mount of Olives opposite the Temple Mount. And they go up to the top of the Temple Mount there. Notice we read, David went up to the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and we're standing on the Temple Mount looking back, not back then, but today. This is what Jerusalem looks like today. And he wept as he walked, and his head was covered, and he walked barefoot. And I can't help but think about another time where someone, the greater son of David, comes up to the Mount of Olives, and he weeps, and he looks over the city, and he says, Jerusalem, how often I wanted to gather you together, but you wouldn't have me. And so here is almost like a foretaste of what would happen 1,000 years later with Jesus. But now it's David going up and weeping over the city. Well, as I said, you have Ahithophel and Hushai, and they are both giving advice to Absalom. And the advice that Ahithophel gives him, as Absalom shows up in Jerusalem, he says, quick, David just left. You can catch him really quick. Just grab whatever forces you've got and go and take him, and you can win this now. And Hushai says, that's not a good idea. What you ought to do is consolidate your forces. You don't want to have enemies behind you and in front of you. So make sure everybody's on your side, consolidate your forces, and then once you've got everything settled, then you can take your time and you can take David out. After all, you've been growing in popularity all this time. You're only going to get stronger. And and Hushai's advice sounds okay, but Ahithophel's advice really was just strategically speaking, the better advice. Well, Absalom begins by taking David's concubines and taking them in a sexual way. And he doesn't do this in secret. He does this out in public as an open sign. Hey, look, everybody, I'm now king. I have power over these wives of the former king. It's crass, and it's meant to be. And so the two proposed plans are given, that of Ahithophel and that of Hushai, and we read that the Lord had ordained to thwart the counsel of Ahithophel. Ahithophel gives his plan. It's a good plan, and it's clearly elocuted. It's clearly put out there, and yet for some reason, and we find out that the reason was the Lord, that the Lord had caused. And it's fascinating here because let me just say, Absalom had his own free will, but the Lord had done something that I don't know if the right word is superseded, but the Lord had ordained something, and when the Lord ordains, it takes place. I don't care what people decide. And so Absalom, out of his own quote unquote free will, goes for the bad advice of Hushai, intentionally bad advice, and he doesn't listen to Ahithophel. And so he consolidates his power, and he's going to go out now. Once he's got his troops together, and by this time David has crossed the Jordan, and he's gotten troops together from the east side of the Jordan River. He's gotten people that are faithful to him. So we read, David and all the people who were with him arose and crossed the Jordan, and by dawn not even one remained who had crossed the Jordan. So they made good their escape. And when Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and arose and went to his home, to his city, and set his house in order and strangled himself. Now, does that remind you of somebody else? Someone who was a betrayer, and who, when I say strangled himself, I don't think that means that he took his own hands and just squeezed. You'd pass it. He probably has to do this some sort of artificial way, and thus he died and was buried in the grave of his father. Reminds you of someone in the New Testament who was known as a betrayer? Sure it does. Well, David, meanwhile, he comes to Mahanaim. That's on the Jabbok River, east side of the Jordan. And so he gets there, and now Absalom, having consolidated his power, he crossed the Jordan and all the men of Israel with him. It still looks like it's going to go, like it could go for Absalom. And instead, we're going to read of a defeat of Israel. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details, how Joab and his brother They split the forces between them, and they come in not two but three different parties. And David says, "Hey, I'll lead a party," and Joab says, "No, no, no, you're the king. If something happens to you, the whole thing is over. So you stay back. If you need, we'll tell you when to come up. You stay back. We've got it covered," and they do. And the people of Israel are defeated, therefore, before the servants of David, and the slaughter there that day was great. 20,000 men died because of the civil war between David and Absalom. For the battle there was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest. Now you say forest? Yes, there were back then forests. It was known as the forest of Ephraim, even though Ephraim's on the tribe of Ephraim's on the other side of the Jordan. The battle there was spread over the whole countryside, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that the trees were eating people. I don't think. But I think it means that the forest didn't allow for the cohesiveness of a whole crowd of warriors, and so they sort of their lines get all messed up, and the forest was a disruptive influence in that. Usually in the ancient world, and really up until fairly recently, when you wanted to have when you wanted to have a battle, you did it in an open area. You avoided forests, and they didn't do that, so it didn't work for them. It goes even worse for Absalom. Absalom happened to meet the servants of David, for Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of a great oak. Again, I take that to be in the forest, and his head caught fast in the oak. So he was left hanging between heaven and earth while the mule that was under him kept going. I imagine, we're not told that his hair had anything to do with it, but remember he had that big head of hair that would actually get weighed, and it was sort of his glory. Perhaps that had something to do with it, but I'm reading into the text, so I want to be careful there. But he gets hung up on this tree, and he gets hung up in a rather permanent way. He's unable to get himself untangled from it. And so Absalom's plight is reported to Joab. Somebody goes back to Joab, "Hey, I happen to see Absalom hanging from a tree. He wasn't hanging dead, I don't think." And so Joab says, "Well, did you kill him?" "No, no, I'm not going to. We were under orders by David. David had given strict instructions, fight the battle, but don't kill Absalom. I want to save him alive." David is still hoping to redeem Absalom. And Joab grabs a couple of spears, 3 spears, and goes and finishes him off. Doesn't care what David said. Joab is going to do what he deems best, no matter what the king says. And so David hears the news, and now David goes into mourning, such as we haven't seen since that first son or that first child of Bathsheba had died at the judgment because of what David had done. So here David is, and again, he's in mourning, he's weeping, and Joab's going to come to him and say, "What are you crying about? We won, and you better stop this because people died for your victory. You need to show a positive face." And he's going to give him a bit of a talking to. So you have Absalom in an interesting parallel, both similar but also very different with Jesus, where Absalom tried to take the kingdom that was not his own. Jesus left his glory to come to the earth and die. What a contrast. In Absalom's case, he was caught in a tree. In Jesus' case, he died upon a tree. I guess you could say Absalom did too. He died on a tree too, not because of the tree, but because of Joab. In Absalom's case, he was pierced by his enemies, specifically by Joab. In Jesus' case, he was pierced by the Roman soldier. Absalom got what he deserved. I'm being a little judgmental there, but I think the text bears me up. Jesus got what we deserved. So contrasts and comparisons. Note the parallel that we have in chapter 16 through 18 first of all, with the actions of Absalom, where he comes to Jerusalem. He receives some advice, some directions from Ahithophel. Those directions, that advice is defeated. Ahithophel's proposal is overturned, and we find out that's the hand of the Lord in doing that. The two messengers we talked about already, the sons of the priests who give their report, and they escape, and they manage to get to David giving the report. And finally, Ahithophel's suicide. So notice Ahithophel is in a number of those points. Next, we saw David coming to Mahanaim, just like Absalom had come to Jerusalem. We saw the directions from David for the battle. David gives some advice and tells them what to do, which they're going to do successfully. We have the defeat of Absalom, just like we had the defeat of Ahithophel's proposal. Absalom himself is defeated. Again, there's two messengers. There's Ahimaaz, and there's a Cushite who's unnamed. And the Cushite is actually Ahimaaz says, "Can I go and give the message that we won?" And uh, Joab says, "Well, there's some good news. There's some bad news. The bad news is that Absalom was killed." And so he sends the Cushite first, and Ahimaaz says, "Can I sort of go and follow him?" And so they both go, and Ahimaaz actually gets there first and gives the good news, but not the bad news. And then the Cushite, who had been sent first, but he's a little slower, he gets there and he gives all the news. And David hears the news of how Absalom has died, and now we have David's grief. So you have Ahithophel's suicide, and there's some grief there, I think. That's why he suicides. And there's David's grief as well. So an interesting parallel again. Now the king has won, but now we're going to read about his return. And as I said, Joab rebukes David for his mourning over Absalom. Says, are you going to weep when so many people gave your lives for you to be where you are? And straighten up and put that grief aside, put that mourning aside, and rejoice before your people. You can feel what you want on the inside, but on the outside, you need to show a proper respect for them, glad that they won the victory, not gee, I wish that Absalom had won. You don't need to be showing that. And so David now allows Absalom's general, Massa, he hasn't really been too much in the forefront, to replace Joab as general. Why is that? We're not told, but remember, Joab had gone against David's wishes and had killed Absalom. And David hadn't wanted that, so maybe that's in view. Now, he doesn't imprison Joab. He doesn't, do anything else. This might have been merely political expedience so that we don't have another civil war breaking out with Massa trying to now become the king. But I can't help but think that Joab's actions might have had something to do with this as well. And that's going to lead to the next thing that we'll see in the next chapter. The tribe of Judah now comes to Gilgal to meet David. Remember, that's traditionally the place where you go to make a king a king. That had happened in the days of Saul. So Gilgal's not in Judah. That's down by the Jordan, just a bit northeast of the old site of where Jericho had been. And Shimei comes. Remember the one who had been cursing David and cursing all the followers of David and throwing dirt and other stuff. And he comes and he asks forgiveness for his curses. And David will allow him sort of on a probational basis. He didn't make any bones about it, but he's not cut down and killed right now. Next, we have Mephibosheth. Remember Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan? And we had that explanation given from Ziba, who said Mephibosheth was just hoping that you were going to get killed, and maybe this would mark his return, and he could eventually be king. And David calls for Mephibosheth and for Ziba. Now, David had said to Ziba, when Ziba had given his report, David had accepted it at face value and said, "Well, Ziba, all that land, all that property that belonged to Saul, that can now be yours," which was maybe what Ziba wanted to hear. And Mephibosheth comes and he says, "Oh no, I was all set to come, and yet Ziba, I ordered my donkey saddled, and he took the donkey, and I'm lame. I can't get there on my own. I needed help, and he didn't give it. He took my wheelchair, so to speak." Um, and David had given all the property to Ziba, and Mephibosheth says, "That's okay, as long as I can be with you, David, as long as I can, serve you, and I'm here for you." Although not very fast because I'm lame. And so David calls for Mephibosheth and Ziba to divide the land. Now, the fact that he calls them to divide the land makes me wonder if David himself is wondering, which story is true. And so I'm not going to determine that. I'm going to take each at what they said, and both of them will benefit from that. Although he says to Mephibosheth, he doesn't say this to Ziba, he says to Mephibosheth, and you always have a place at my table. And so he will be at the king's table. Now, again, is that so I can keep an eye on you, or is that to give you a place of honor? And I can't see in David's heart, and neither can they. So I'm just going to leave that as a question mark. So Mephibosheth relinquishes the ownership. He says, that wasn't important to me. Only David is important to me. And now we find out that Barzillai, this was one of the older tribal heads from the east side of the Jordan who had he had come over to David when David escaped to the east side of the Jordan. He had met up with armed forces. I'm here to we're going to be on David's side. We are here to protect you and to fight for you. And he's an older guy, and so he's accompanying the king back to Jerusalem for his sort of his victory parade. And he's also offered a place at the king's table, again a place of honor. And Barzillai, he says, I'm sort of old for that. I really need to get back home. Love you, glad to fight for you. And he sends Kikam as his representative. Let him be the one that you honor in my place. But I'm just not up to that task. Chapter 19, verse 41. And behold, all the men of Israel came. So you've had individuals coming, but now you have everyone else in Israel. Remember, all of Israel supposedly had gone over to Absalom. And they come to the king, and they said to the king, why had our brothers, the men of Judah, stolen you away and brought the king and his household and all David's men with him over the Jordan? Why didn't you call us to follow you? And you say, well, wait a minute, weren't they following Absalom? What's going on here? Are they trying to take credit? Are they trying to take offense? If anybody should be offended, it should be David. And so you have this ongoing dispute between the men of Israel and the men of Judah. And David's like, what's going on here? And he's not going to chastise them because their loyalty that's been sort of up in the air. But this contention, this stress between the men of Israel and the men of Judah is something that we're going to continue in a multi-generational issue. So notice, all the men of Judah answered the men of Israel, because the king is a close relative to us. Hey, he's one of us. He's from Judah. Why then are you angry about this matter? Have we eaten at all the king's expense, or has anything been taken for us? You haven't been supporting us. Hint, hint, hint. Who were you supporting? And we read, but the men of Israel answered the men of Judah and said, we have 10 parts in the king. 12 tribes, we're 10 of them. Therefore, we also have more claim on David than you. Why then did you treat us with contempt? Was it not our advice first to bring back our king, which they had said that? Yet the words of the men of Judah were harsher than the words of the men of Israel, and neither one is willing to back down, and this contention continues to grow. And so we have them fighting among themselves as to who has the better claim over David. And that's going to continue after the death of David, after the death of Solomon even. We're going to have this issue between the men of Israel and the men of Judah, almost like they're two separate countries, which they eventually will become. And it reminds me a bit, I don't want to make too many parallels, it reminds me a bit of the denominational sort of thing that we see in Christianity today, where Christianity is way too divided. And I have to admit, sometimes those divisions needed to be there, because there were those that went away from Jesus, and they call themselves Christians, but they rejected the scriptures, and they rejected what Jesus had to teach, and they rejected the salvation that he provides. So I get it, but I'm still saddened by it. And one of the things that I'm getting personal here, one of the things I get to do is I get to teach in a Bible college that is, it crosses a bunch of denominational lines, and it brings folks from a number of different denominations, not just the students, but even the professors. And we all agree on what the gospel is. We all agree that Jesus died and rose again, and that we trust in him for our salvation. And a lot of the other things that are peculiar to specific denominations, even my own, things that where I might have a strong opinion, um, we get along in spite of those things. We don't do away with the differences. We talk about them. Sometimes we'll even have debates, but they're all within the umbrella of Christianity, and they're all in under the shadow of the love of Jesus and the love of God and the love of each other as well. And I think that's the way I think that's a better way. If I can borrow from Paul's writing in 1 Corinthians 13, that's a better way. And would that we could see that unity all throughout the church.